we very rarely find people that understand the business of a portfolio management firm. They may be a great portfolio manager, but that business aspect is something that they don't either haven't thought about, haven't had to think about, don't feel like thinking about. But having that forethought before they just put the shingle up, that they figure out how much capital do we need? Where do we find that capital? Do we have it? Do we need to kind of stay where we are for another 6 months to save up some money? That part of the business, if there's one thing that, we hope emerging managers get out of this is, we know you're great at your investment part. Make sure you're spending time thinking about the structure of your business, your target market, how you're going to get there, how you're going to grow assets. Those parts of the business that you think are kind of the boring, not what I want to be talking about part, we think that's the real differentiator. Spend time there. Everything related to infrastructure, compliance, capital resources, things like that will help you in the end.
And I'd like to actually talk a bit more about that side. Certainly, we've covered a lot of preconditions on the investment side already, and the two certainly overlap as well, as we've seen. But perhaps on the business side, then, assuming that we're dealing with, let's say, an emerging manager, so just starting out, not any money really there yet. And okay, the philosophy is a genuine value philosophy, so the preconditions on the investment side are fairly decent, and they exhibit a lot of the characteristics that we talked about in terms of thinking about concentration and let's say remaining size and sector agnostic and so on. What is then really some practical advice you can give on the business side, or perhaps to illustrate what are some things that emerging managers, what are some common mistakes that bright, sort of really good investors tend to get tripped up on the business side?
A mentor of mine, a gentleman named Bert White, he's now a managing director of LPL in their research department. He kind of coined a phrase or a kind of a thought process of operating infrastructure, repeatability of process, and survivability. Now, when we were working, through some events, it was more of management team leaves one firm and joins another firm. But the thought process to me actually is much more applicable to a firm starting out. You have to figure out how to create an operational infrastructure that supports your business. You then have to make sure that whatever inputs you had to make your investment decisions are available to you in your firm, your startup firm, so that you can repeat the process that you had been doing prior. And then the survivability is how long can we make it without winning any business? Because sometimes it may take you 2 or 3 years before you start seeing the assets coming through if your track record is what you hope it's going to be. So from what we have seen at the startup level is everyone thinks if I build it, they will come mentality, which is no longer the case. You could have the greatest track record in the world, but if no one knows about it, you're not going to get any money. So you see this overly optimistic thought that the money's just going to flow into me as soon as I open the door. So emerging managers really need to think of the first 3 years, I'm going to get nothing, no assets at all. Can I make it 3 years? And so you have to make sure you have either saved yourself, or you have found a partner that can give you that startup capital in the way Dave said, though, with the opportunity to buy it back over time. But people need to realize that just because you're great doesn't mean the money's going to flow over, and certainly not to the level that you expect. I've also seen then equally not only optimism that the assets are going to flow over, but that they would be able to support a huge team of people already. So they may bring all of their investment team at another firm, and then all of a sudden they become top heavy. And so they don't focus on expense management. So as I said, these folks may be critical of the expense managements of the companies they're looking at, but they need to be as critical. So I see very few companies actually understanding that we need to keep expenses down, but not lose quality, so they don't think through how to properly manage that. And then they ultimately determine that they don't need to worry about compliance. They don't need to worry about the infrastructure that it takes to run the business. They don't feel like putting time into all of the things that make the organization run, from accounting to legal to custodial to technology. Everything in that part they just don't feel like messing with, because it's not what they want to do. And we have found that the majority of problems at a manager are not performance related. It is a regulatory hiccup, an infraction that was missed because they just didn't put their time and attention. We have found most clients, at least for a period of time, will work through poor performance. The SEC writes you a letter, allocators just can't stay. I mean, they just can't stay. And most of the time, the SEC letters don't come from poor performance. It comes from not managing the internal infrastructure. So from where we've sat on doing the work, we have people don't think of survivability, so they don't set aside enough capital in the beginning. They don't focus on expense management in the beginning. They target the wrong type of client, so they end up with no success at all, rather than really kind of finding the right client to start with. And then they determine that they just don't want to mess with any of the compliance or regulatory infrastructure that's required now, and they'll end up having some major infraction that trips them up before they even get a chance.
I would echo what Todd said about having patience and being ready to be irrelevant for a while. I think Seth Klarman was irrelevant for a very long time until he wasn't. And 3 years, I think when you look at the trajectory of asset flows, and this is if you're doing everything right, it tends to happen in that 5th, 6th, 7th year or beyond. And you almost want it to happen then, because you're showing a commitment to the allocators and to whether it's an endowment or it's a multifamily office. They want to get to know you. They want to know how you're going to invest. They want to be sure you're going to be sticking around for the next 10 years, 20 years. And that doesn't happen in one meeting. It doesn't happen in 2 or 3 meetings. And sometimes it happens over a multi-year period. But I would say the managers that get that type of asset have sticky assets. So these are folks that may take a while to allocate, but they stay because they did their work, and it's almost like the agony of defeat for them to pull money from a manager, because it essentially tells them that they did a bad job doing the research in the first place. So patience is needed, a commitment to the process. A lot of these managers hate marketing. You got to market, and it's not a salesmanship, showbiz type thing. It's a showman of commitment, and that you're in this thing for the long term, and we want you as a partner. And really, the only way to do that is through exposure, accessibility. You have to think about your letters. You have to think about the presentation book. You have to potentially think about public relations if that's the way you want to go, because that could be helpful depending on the audience you want to be marketing to. So those are things that I would add to Todd's comments about that.
Yeah, and I think one thing that managers, I don't know if they understand, some do, but when a manager is talking to an allocator, the CIO of a family office or a multifamily office or an endowment, that's when their reputation and their necks are on the line. So the manager's reputation is on the line when they make an investment in a company. The allocator's reputation is on the line when they're picking a manager. And it goes to what Dave was saying about career risk. Managers that take the time to make sure that allocator truly understands what that portfolio is about, what they're about, how they do their business, is going to make that allocator more comfortable to put their neck on the line. And that takes time, and that takes focus, and that takes effort, and that takes doing exactly what Dave said, creating that communication line, which, kind of all tying back to your limiting capacity, when a manager isn't trying to be all things to all people, they can give more access to the partners that they want. That helps to build that, but that takes time. And so knowing that when they start their firm, it could, hopefully not. Hopefully they open day one and get the assets that they want, but going in with the idea that this could be a tough road, but a very fruitful one if they take the time and effort to do it, it can work. But the one thing I would go back to is, when any manager that's thinking about doing this, think about operational infrastructure, repeatability of process, and survivability. If they can answer those three things, then they're going to have a good shot of making the transition to a long life manager, not just an emerging.